It was a bitterly cold evening when the sharp, frantic knock shattered the quiet at 221B Baker Street. I looked up from my journal as Holmes, seated by the fire with his pipe, raised an eyebrow. "We appear to have a caller in distress, Watson," he remarked, his tone betraying mild curiosity. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a woman draped in a dark cloak, her trembling hands clutching the edges as though it were the only thing keeping her together. Her pale face and wide, fearful eyes revealed her torment before she uttered a word. I am Eleanor Brayton," she began, her voice quivering. "I have come to you because I've nowhere else to turn." She hesitated, wringing her hands before continuing in a rushed whisper. "It is my husband, Mr. Holmes. He died a month ago. But last night I heard him, clear as day, calling my name from the study." Holmes motioned to the chair opposite him. "Please, Mrs. Brayton, be seated. Watson, some tea, if you will." As I poured the tea, she sat, her gaze darting nervously about the room. Holmes leaned forward, his sharp gray eyes fixed upon her. "Your husband's voice, you say? Were you alone at the time?" "Yes," she murmured. "I was in my bedroom when I heard it. Eleanor!" She imitated the cry, her voice cracking. It was unmistakably his. "Most peculiar," Holmes said, his fingers steepled. "Tell me, Mrs. Brayton, what prompted you to come here tonight?" I fear for my sanity, Mr. Holmes," she admitted. "The house feels cursed. I beg you to help me." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Fear not, Mrs. Brayton. The truth shall prevail." Holmes leaned back, gesturing for Mrs. Brayton to continue. "You mentioned other unusual occurrences. Elaborate, if you please." She nodded, her hands trembling as she clasped the teacup I had handed her. "It began with small things. Books falling from shelves, windows opening on their own. Then I saw him." Her voice dropped to a whisper, and I leaned closer, unable to conceal my own unease. "In the garden," she continued, "just as the sun was setting, a figure stood among the hedges, shrouded in mist. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I stepped closer, I saw his face. It was my husband, staring back at me with eyes that did not belong to this world." Watson's hand tightened around the armrest of his chair. "Surely, Mrs. Brayton, you are mistaken," I interjected, though even to my own ears, my words lacked conviction. "I know what I saw, Dr. Watson," she replied firmly, "and what I heard. Last night his voice came again, repeating the words he spoke on his deathbed. 'Eleanor, beware, they are coming for you.'" Her voice broke and tears slid down her cheeks. Holmes observed her in silence, his expression inscrutable. Finally he spoke, his voice steady and calm. "Your account is most intriguing, Mrs. Brayton. Tell me, do you believe anyone might wish you harm?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "None that I can think of. My husband had his share of business rivals, but I am no threat to anyone." Holmes tapped his fingers together thoughtfully. "Interesting. Fear not, madam. The answers lie not with specters, but with the living. Watson, prepare yourself. We have a case that promises to be most enlightening." As Mrs. Brayton's trembling voice faltered, Holmes sat motionless, his piercing gaze fixed upon her. His fingers, steepled before him, twitched occasionally, a sure sign that his mind was at work. I could see that he was not merely listening, but dissecting her every word, her tone, her gestures, every nuance of her distress. "Mrs. Brayton," he began softly, his voice carrying the weight of measured authority, "you spoke of books falling from the shelves and windows opening on their own. Yet, as you recount these events, I notice that your hands betray a different story. They do not tremble when you mention these phenomena. Why?" The woman blinked, startled. I suppose because such things, though unsettling, do not frighten me as deeply as hearing his voice." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, his gaze narrowing. "Yet, fear manifests in strange ways, and fear, my dear madam, is often the mask of something more tangible. Guilt, perhaps, or deception." Her eyes widened in alarm. "You think I am lying?" she stammered. "Not lying," Holmes corrected, his tone as sharp as a scalpel. "But perhaps omitting certain truths. For instance, you mentioned hearing your late husband's voice, yet you failed to describe the precise circumstances. Was the room dark? Were there any others present in the house? Details, Mrs. Brayton, are the marrow of truth." She swallowed hard. It was late, past midnight. The house was silent save for the wind. I was alone, Mr. Holmes, as I have been since his passing. Holmes leaned back, a faint smile playing on his lips. Alone. Curious, yet entirely plausible. Please continue. Mrs. Brayton took a steadying breath, her words coming slower now, as if she feared each one might betray her. Holmes allowed the silence to linger, his presence commanding yet strangely reassuring. "You must understand," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband's passing was sudden, but not unnatural. The doctors said it was his heart." "Did they now?" Holmes interjected, his tone skeptical. "And yet, you describe hearing his final words, a warning, no less, repeated after his death. Curious, wouldn't you say, Watson?" I nodded, though my thoughts were far from composed. The tale had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Holmes rose suddenly, his long figure casting an imposing shadow across the room. "Mrs. Brayton, I shall take your case, though not for the reasons you might assume." He strode to the mantelpiece, retrieving his pipe with a deliberate air. "The dead may whisper," he said cryptically, his back to us, "but it is the living who scream." Turning to face her, his gray eyes burned with intensity. "Your husband's voice, whether conjured by your fears or engineered by some clever charlatan, speaks of a plot yet unfinished. And plots, Mrs. Brayton, are far more dangerous when left to fester in the dark." Tears glistened in her eyes, a mixture of relief and trepidation. "You mean you believe me?" "I believe," Holmes replied, lighting his pipe with a flourish, "that you are the victim of a deception most foul, and I intend to uncover it." With that, he turned to me, his expression one of quiet resolve. "Come, Watson. The game is afoot." The carriage wheels ground to a halt, sending a shudder through the stillness of the estate. Holmes stepped out first, his sharp eyes scanning the estate with that air of detached curiosity I had come to recognize. I followed closely, the chill of the fog biting at my skin. The mansion loomed before us, its stone facade dark and weathered, its windows staring out like hollow eyes in the mist. No sounds of life stirred. The trees swayed uneasily, their rustling the only thing disturbing the profound silence. "Remarkable," Holmes muttered, his voice low. "The air of desolation here is palpable, Watson. You feel it, don't you?" I nodded, my own unease rising as I stepped onto the gravel path, the fog swirling around us like a living thing. "I don't like it," I confessed, glancing at the imposing structure. "The silence. It's as if this house is holding its breath." Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, turning his attention to the housekeeper waiting by the door, a woman in her late 40s, pale and trembling in the cold. Her eyes darted nervously between us, her hands clasped tightly before her as if holding herself together. "I wonder if she will be as forthcoming as her employer was," Holmes mused, more to himself than to me. "It would seem we are in for a most interesting visit." We made our way up the stairs, the fog thickening around us, muffling the world beyond the gates. It was as if the house had pulled us into its grasp, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something much darker than we had anticipated. The door creaked open, and the housekeeper's anxious face appeared, framed by the dark wood of the threshold. Her eyes were wide, filled with an unmistakable fear, yet her movements were stiff, controlled. I could feel the tension building, though it seemed subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone unfamiliar with such subtle tells. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, her voice a mere whisper. I wasn't expecting visitors, but..." Her words faltered and she glanced over her shoulder as though she feared someone might be listening. Holmes wasted no time. "I am certain you weren't," he said coolly, "but we've come in response to the unfortunate happenings here. Might I inquire as to whether the household has had any unusual disturbances since the death of Mr. Brayton?" She hesitated, the air thick with her discomfort. Her fingers twisted in her apron and she cleared her throat before replying. "No, sir. Nothing of note. Just the usual, of course." Holmes studied her intently. "The usual?" His tone remained casual, but the underlying sharpness was unmistakable. "Such as? A heavy footfall? The sounds of furniture moving on their own?" She flinched at the mention of moving furniture, her eyes flickering toward the staircase behind her, and for a moment I swore I saw her hesitate, as though considering whether to tell us the truth. Holmes's gaze never wavered. "I must insist that you are entirely forthcoming with us, Mrs. Fielding. The truth, however elusive, is the key to solving this mystery. We both know that." Her shoulders slumped slightly, and with a weary sigh she led us into the mansion's heart. "I suppose there is no use hiding it. Please, follow me." Holmes strode into Mr. Brayton's study with the precision of a man who knew exactly where to look. The room was somber, its shelves lined with dusty volumes that hadn't seen a hand in years. The air smelled faintly of old paper and something else, something faintly metallic. But it wasn't the room itself that intrigued Holmes. It was the desk. He approached it carefully, his eyes scanning the papers strewn across the surface. My attention followed his every movement, but it was the silence that struck me most. No creaking floorboards, no distant sounds from the house, only the muffled rush of my own thoughts. "There's something here," Holmes murmured as his fingers brushed across the desk. He paused, leaning closer. A half-burned letter. "Notice the edges, Watson. Still smoldering, yet completely ruined. It is not the work of a careless flame, but of something deliberate." I bent closer, the faint odor of charred paper filling my nose. Holmes continued to inspect the desk, picking up a small object, a candle holder with traces of wax near its base. "What does this tell you, Holmes?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile, though his eyes never left the desk. "It suggests that someone was desperate to conceal a piece of correspondence, and the wax, deliberately applied to obscure what was written." I looked at him, both intrigued and unsettled. "You believe Mr. Brayton was hiding something?" Holmes's voice dropped to a near whisper, as though not wanting to disturb the very atmosphere of the room. "Indeed, Watson. And I believe we have just uncovered a piece of a puzzle far more intricate than we first imagined." The room suddenly felt colder, and I could almost hear the faintest sobs drifting from somewhere deep within the mansion. A voice, low and mournful, echoed through the silence. "Why did you betray me?" Holmes straightened, his expression hardening. "There's a voice in the darkness," he muttered, "but not one from the grave." As Holmes examined the desk, I found myself unnervingly aware of a distant sound that seemed to permeate the very walls of the Brayton estate. At first, I thought it might be my imagination, but the muffled sobs grew louder, sobbing that was indistinguishable from human grief. I turned, straining my ears to catch the source. The air, thick with the scent of aged wood and dust, seemed to tighten. And then, through the silence, a voice, low and unmistakably anguished. "Why did you betray me?" The words echoed through the house, reverberating like a haunting refrain. Yet no one else was visible. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as the sound pressed closer, though no one was in sight. The sobs continued, but now joined by a faint rattle, a sound of something scraping across the floor, before it vanished as abruptly as it had come. I glanced at Holmes, expecting some sign of reaction, but he stood still, his face impassive as ever. "Holmes, did you hear that?" I asked, my voice betraying a touch of the unease I felt. Holmes did not answer immediately, his sharp gaze narrowing, his lips parted, but instead of words, he gave me a quiet, almost imperceptible nod. "There is more to this place than meets the eye, Watson," he murmured. "Much more." Holmes's quiet acknowledgment left me both unsettled and intrigued, and I watched as he carefully turned back to the half-burned letter. He inspected it with an air of deliberate concentration, as if each fragmented piece were part of a larger, unsolved puzzle. His hand hovered over the wax traces, his fingers curling slightly as he lifted one piece of the letter that had survived the flames. "A concealed communication, Watson," he mused. "The act of destruction, not one of carelessness, but of intent." I watched in silence, my mind racing to make sense of the events. It was as though the very house was alive with some unseen force, one that watched, one that whispered. Holmes glanced up at me, his expression grave. "There is a voice in the darkness, but not one from the grave, Watson. The dead do not call out in such a manner." I felt my breath catch, a cold shiver creeping down my spine. "Then, who was it?" I whispered, the question hanging in the air. Holmes's gaze hardened, his mind already several steps ahead. "The living, Watson. Someone alive, and perhaps very close to this place." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but I could not yet see the full picture. Holmes's keen interest in the details of the late Mr. Brayton's life was immediately apparent. He had the air of a man who understood that every hidden corner held a clue, no matter how small. The investigation into Brayton's affairs began in earnest, with Holmes delving into his business dealings, his associates, and any potential motives for his untimely death. The name Brayton was known to me, an influential businessman, respected by some, feared by others. But what struck Holmes was a growing pattern of enemies. Mr. Brayton's competitors were many, but there is one in particular who stands out, Holmes said, his voice steady as he perused a ledger of financial transactions. "I suspect he had more than business dealings to worry about. This rivalry wasn't confined to the boardroom." He paused, then continued with a look of quiet certainty. "His associate, Reginald Crowley, was one to watch, a man of considerable ambition and, I suspect, willing to go to any lengths to eliminate competition." I leaned forward, the intrigue growing in my chest. But why would Brayton be targeted so openly? Holmes tapped the paper thoughtfully. "Brayton had a great many dealings in the darker side of commerce, the sort of dealings that leave shadows behind, Watson. This was no ordinary rivalry. It was a contest for control of something far more dangerous." I reflected on this for a moment, but Holmes was already moving on, his mind racing to conclusions yet to be revealed. "It's all tied together, Watson," he continued, his gaze piercing. "The business, the rivalry, and the fear. The pieces may be scattered, but the truth lurks just out of view." Mrs. Brayton's confession was a revelation that would forever change our understanding of her husband's death. We had just finished examining the study and were seated in the drawing room when she nervously approached Holmes. Her face was pale, her hands wringing together as if struggling with a weight too heavy to bear. "I must tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "Before my husband died, he was terrified." Holmes gave her a long, steady look, allowing the silence to draw her in. "Terrified? Of what, madam?" She hesitated, casting a glance at the floor, her eyes darkened with the memory. "He believed he was being followed," she whispered, almost as though speaking of a shadow that would not leave. "He spoke of it several times in his last days. There was a presence that he felt closing in. I didn't know what to make of it, but it was real to him." I saw the tremor in her voice. the pain of a woman caught in a web of fear and helplessness. Holmes's face softened for a moment, but only a moment. Then, with his usual clarity, he leaned forward. Had he given any reason for this belief? Holmes inquired, his tone sharp, yet not unkind. She shook her head, her eyes clouded with doubt. Number only that he felt eyes upon him, that someone was watching, waiting. Holmes nodded slowly. A most peculiar fear, he murmured, but his mind was already working, weaving together the threads of the case. And we shall discover what lies behind it. After Mrs. Brayton's confession, Holmes and I ventured out to the fog-shrouded grounds surrounding the Brayton estate. The atmosphere outside felt no less oppressive than within the walls of the house, and I found myself unnerved by the silence that hung heavy in the air. Holmes, however, was focused, his eyes scanning the ground with the precision of a hawk. "I believe the truth may lie beyond the walls of this house," Holmes remarked, his voice barely rising above a whisper. I nodded, following his lead, though my steps faltered as I looked about at the sprawling grounds. The thick mist seemed to coil around the estate, a suffocating blanket that obscured the path ahead. Suddenly, Holmes stopped, his keen eyes tracing something in the damp earth. He knelt down, and I joined him. Footprints. Unmistakably human, but their size and depth suggested something odd. The impressions were too deliberate, too calculated. The footprints led directly toward the family crypt, their trail uninterrupted, as though someone, or something, had walked with purpose, leaving no trace of hesitation behind. "What do you make of these?" Holmes asked, his voice laced with intrigue. "They lead straight to the crypt," I replied, the weight of the discovery sinking in. "But why would anyone walk there in such conditions? And at such a time?" Holmes stood, his face unreadable. "Precisely, Watson. That is the question, and I believe we are close to understanding the answer." With a final glance at the crypt, Holmes turned to me. "Let us proceed. The answers await, but we must not let them slip away unnoticed." As we sat in the dimly lit drawing room, Holmes's mind seemed to be unraveling the entire mystery before my eyes. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking together in a way that left me both in awe and a touch unsettled. He turned to me, his voice calm but sharp, as if the truth had finally emerged from the shadows. "Mrs. Brayton's cries," Holmes began, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest, "were no mere product of grief or madness. They were part of an orchestrated scheme. Someone sought to manipulate her emotions, to provoke terror." I leaned forward, my heart racing at the implications. But why? What could someone gain from such a cruel act? Holmes's eyes gleamed with the intensity of a man on the brink of a revelation. "It is quite simple, Watson. Mrs. Brayton's fear was to be harnessed, used as a weapon against her. Whoever is behind this, whether it be her husband's rivals or some other adversary, intended to make her pliable, to wear her down mentally and emotionally. The threat was never real, but the fear was." I opened my mouth to respond, but Holmes held up a hand, silencing me. "The cries were timed, Watson. The voice, intended to sound like Mr. Brayton's, was no ghost. It was a man with a voice far too human to belong to a dead man. The strategy was simple: frighten her, destabilize her, and then, when she was most vulnerable, move in for whatever goal they had in mind." I felt a chill settle over me. Holmes's deductions were always coldly precise, but this one in particular seemed to echo the sinister nature of the forces at play. "But who would go to such lengths?" I asked, my voice thick with unease. Holmes's lips curled into a slight knowing smile. "Ah, Watson, that is the question we are yet to answer." Just as I was poised to press Holmes for further details, his demeanor shifted. The sharpness in his eyes softened for a moment, and with a deep breath he pushed himself away from the chair. I watched, perplexed, as he began to pace the room, clearly lost in thought. "We will need more information," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to me. But there is a step we must take before we proceed any further. I frowned. What do you mean, Holmes? We've uncovered something crucial. Surely it's time to... But Holmes interrupted, his voice cutting through my confusion with its usual certainty. We are not yet finished here, Watson. There is something important at Scotland Yard that requires our immediate attention. He paused and turned towards me, his face unreadable. We must leave now. I could not hide my surprise. But Holmes, we are on the verge of solving this. Surely you can't leave the investigation hanging like this? Holmes met my gaze, his eyes briefly flickering with something I could not place. I have seen enough to know we are closer than we think, but this next step is critical. The Yard holds the key to something we are missing. I am confident of it. With that, Holmes abruptly rose and moved toward the door, leaving me with more questions than answers. I had long learned to trust his instincts, but I could not shake the feeling that his sudden shift was a tactic, one designed to keep me, and perhaps even himself, on edge. The walls of Scotland Yard reverberated with the usual hum of activity as Holmes and I entered, the weight of our investigation pressing down upon us. Inspector Lestrade, a stout man whose sharp features could not hide his usual unease in Holmes's presence, approached us quickly. "Ah, Holmes, Watson," Lestrade greeted with a mixture of hesitation and urgency. "I've got something you need to hear." Without preamble, he handed Holmes a folded sheet of paper. Holmes's gaze flicked over it, his brow furrowing slightly. "Another suspicious death?" Holmes asked, his voice cool but curious. Lestrade nodded grimly. "Exactly. A man named Edward Huxley, an associate of Brayton's, was found dead at the Green Lantern Inn. It seems to be another case of foul play, much like Mr. Brayton's, but the timing... It happened the very night Brayton died." Holmes paused, the silence stretching between us. I could feel the tension growing in the room as Holmes absorbed the new information. "Is there any connection between them?" I asked, my voice low. "I believe so," Lestrade answered. "Huxley and Brayton had business dealings. We found a letter in Huxley's room, speaking of a meeting with Brayton that was to take place the night of his death. But there's more. Huxley was seen in the company of some rather unsavory figures. This may be bigger than a simple business rivalry." Holmes's eyes gleamed as he folded the paper, his mind already turning over the possibilities. A betrayal, perhaps, or something darker still. We must investigate further. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten, knowing that this revelation only deepened the mystery. But Holmes was already moving, his determination palpable. We returned to the Brayton estate as quickly as possible, Holmes's mind racing ahead with the implications of the information we'd just received. After a quick dinner, we were back in the study, where Holmes began sifting through the late Mr. Brayton's papers once more, a sharp focus on his face. "Holmes, what are we looking for?" I asked, watching him methodically sort through the stacks of correspondence. "Something of value, Watson," he murmured, not looking up. "A document that may explain much more than we've yet uncovered." He reached for a pile of papers that seemed inconspicuous at first, but after a moment's pause, he carefully pulled one out. It was a letter, one that had clearly been forged, the ink smudged in places, and the signature slightly irregular. "This is it," Holmes said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his deduction. "A forged document, one that was likely used to manipulate Brayton or Huxley. It speaks of a debt owed and a threat hanging over Brayton's head. This letter is a tool of blackmail." I took the paper from him, inspecting it closely. But why would Huxley be involved in such a scheme? Holmes straightened, his gaze piercing. "Because Huxley was more than just an associate, Watson. He was Brayton's accomplice, or rather, Brayton's betrayal. The document was not only a means of blackmail, it was a sign of trust turned treachery." The revelation struck me like a blow, and yet Holmes's next words confirmed my worst fears. The death of Huxley wasn't a coincidence. He was silenced. just as Brayton was. The room grew heavy with the weight of the truth, and I could sense that Holmes was already piecing together the final part of the puzzle. As night fell over the Brayton estate, the atmosphere grew thicker with suspense. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the mist-shrouded grounds. Holmes had insisted we return under the cover of darkness, and though I had no doubt of his reasoning, I felt a palpable sense of unease as we stepped onto the grounds once more. "What are we hoping to find, Holmes?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper as we approached the estate's entrance. "There is something hidden beneath the study, Watson," he replied, his eyes scanning the house with a predatory focus. "We need to uncover it." We moved quietly, our footsteps muffled by the damp ground beneath us. Holmes led the way to the study, where he immediately set to work on a particular section of the floor near the desk. I watched him with growing curiosity. There was something about his movements that suggested he was not merely looking for clues, but something deeper, a hidden truth. After what seemed an eternity, Holmes's fingers brushed against a loose floorboard. He gave me a quick, knowing glance, then pried it open, revealing a dark space beneath. "There it is," he said, a quiet triumph in his voice. "A secret passage." I stepped forward, my heart racing. But before I could ask any further questions, I suddenly felt the floor shift beneath me. The trapdoor, cleverly concealed, creaked open beneath my weight, and I lurched forward, my arms flailing to catch myself. "Watson!" Holmes's voice rang out in alarm as he grabbed my arm just in time, pulling me back from the precipice. "Be careful. The dead may not speak, but their killers are eager to silence us." I stared down into the dark void below, my breath catching in my throat. The trapdoor was not merely a secret, it was a warning. Holmes's words echoed in my mind as we both stood, tense, on the brink of something far more dangerous than we could have imagined. The trapdoor lay just beneath the loose floorboard, its dark mouth a silent invitation to danger. Holmes stood over it, his sharp gaze fixed on the opening, as though he could sense the truth hiding in its depths. His fingers brushed the edges of the board, testing for any other hidden mechanisms, before he spoke, his voice low but filled with intensity. "Watson, the presence of this passage suggests more than mere curiosity. It is as though Brayton sought to hide something, not from us, but from whoever would have entered his study uninvited." I nodded, my pulse quickening. There was a palpable sense of urgency in Holmes's words, a warning buried in the casual delivery. Holmes had found this passage for a reason, and I could not shake the feeling that it was part of a web far larger than we had yet uncovered. Without further hesitation, he carefully lifted the floorboard completely, revealing the narrow space beneath. The passage was concealed well. Too well, I thought, and it seemed to stretch further into the earth, unseen by the naked eye. I knelt beside Holmes, peering into the darkness. "What do you suppose it leads to?" Holmes paused, eyes narrowing. "A place of great significance, Watson. Brayton's secretive nature makes it clear that he went to great lengths to keep certain matters hidden. If he was indeed blackmailed, it is likely that the answers lie within these very walls." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I could feel the tension mount as Holmes carefully descended into the passage, his footsteps soft but resolute. I followed closely, my heart hammering in my chest as we ventured further into the hidden corridor. Each step was an invitation to uncovering a truth far darker than I had anticipated. As we descended deeper into the passage, the air grew thick and stale, a foreboding chill settling into my bones. Holmes moved with a quiet certainty, his figure a shadow before me, but I found myself distracted by a growing sense of unease. The passage narrowed, forcing us to move with careful steps, our movements cautious and deliberate. Holmes's silhouette seemed to shrink as he advanced, his focus entirely on the path ahead. I, however, could not shake the nagging feeling that something was not right. Every creak of the floor, every shift in the air made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Suddenly, my foot caught on something unexpected, and I lurched forward. The world seemed to tilt for a brief moment as the ground beneath me gave way. A trap door, hidden expertly under a layer of dust and debris, had suddenly revealed itself. I teetered on the edge, my body leaning dangerously toward the dark abyss below. A sharp breath caught in my throat and panic surged through me as I reached out for anything to steady myself. In a swift motion, Holmes's hand shot out, grasping my arm with surprising force. "Watson!" he cried, his voice laced with urgency as he pulled me back just in time. "Careful! These killers do not wish to be discovered. They would not hesitate to silence anyone who threatens their secrecy." My heart pounded in my chest, the near miss sending a surge of adrenaline through my veins. I staggered back, grateful for Holmes's quick thinking. His gaze lingered on the trap door for a moment longer, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "This passage leads somewhere important, Watson. They meant for you to fall, but we shall not be so easily deterred." With those words, Holmes turned back to the darkness ahead, and I followed closely, my mind racing with the realization that we were now in far deeper than I had ever imagined. The killers were desperate to keep their secrets, but it was becoming increasingly clear that we were drawing closer to the truth. Holmes's voice echoed faintly ahead as we made our way deeper into the narrow passage, the walls pressing in around us. Each step we took seemed to reverberate through the cold stone, as if the very air in the passage were waiting for us to uncover its secrets. "There is something here," Holmes muttered, pausing abruptly. "Do you hear it, Watson?" I strained my ears, but there was only silence, eerie and profound. We continued onward, our footsteps muted by the damp air, until we came upon an unusual contraption hidden in the recesses of the tunnel. It was a strange mechanism of gears and pulleys, inconspicuously placed behind a false wall. Holmes knelt beside it, his brow furrowing as his fingers danced over the device. "A clever contraption, indeed," he murmured. "It's designed to project sound, Watson. From the study above us, no less." I leaned in, my heart quickening as the realization struck me. "You mean someone used this to mimic the cries Mrs. Brayton heard?" "Precisely," Holmes replied, his tone laced with grim satisfaction. "This mechanism is capable of transmitting sound directly into the walls of the house. The cries, the very cries that Mrs. Brayton mistook for supernatural disturbances, were nothing more than carefully orchestrated noises." The truth felt like a chilling breath on the back of my neck, a plot so intricate it was designed to prey on the fears of the innocent. We continued our examination, but my mind raced with the implications. Who, I wondered, would go to such lengths to create a false terror? Holmes's keen eyes scanned the hidden nook within the passage, where he found a small, weathered journal tucked away beneath a pile of old papers. It was a simple leather-bound book, its edges frayed with age, but it emanated a sense of foreboding as Holmes carefully flipped it open. "This," he said, his voice low, "could be the key to unraveling it all." I leaned closer as he began to read aloud the scrawled entries, each one more damning than the last. Huxley's words spoke of deceit, betrayal, and a conspiracy so dark that it seemed almost too terrible to be true. "I must act quickly," Holmes read. "Brayton cannot be allowed to uncover the full truth. The document has been forged. His ruin is near, and with it, my victory." I could feel the weight of Huxley's words settling on me as though the very atmosphere had thickened with the poison of betrayal. So, Brayton wasn't the victim after all, I murmured, the realization dawning on me. He was being framed. Holmes closed the journal with a snap, his expression grim but resolute. Indeed, Edward Huxley, in league with others, intended to destroy Brayton and frame him for crimes he did not commit. But their scheme goes even deeper than that. This was no mere financial feud. It was a plot designed to erase Brayton from the very fabric of his world. A deep silence fell between us, the weight of Huxley's treachery settling over us like an oppressive fog. "What of Mrs. Brayton?" I asked, a nagging question at the back of my mind. Holmes turned to me, his gaze intense. "She was a pawn, Watson, just like her late husband. But whether she knew of the conspiracy or was simply its victim remains to be seen. As we retraced our steps through the passage, the air grew colder, and a sense of impending danger gnawed at me. Holmes moved with quiet assurance, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He, too, felt the unseen eyes watching our every movement. And then a sound, a soft shuffle, reached our ears. Holmes halted instantly, his hand on my arm signaling me to remain still. We stood motionless in the suffocating darkness, our breath barely audible, as the sound grew louder, closer. Without warning, a voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have come this far," it said, low and threatening. The housekeeper stepped forward from the shadows, her eyes wide with fear. I was only trying to protect them," she stammered, her hands trembling. Holmes took a step toward her, his voice firm. "Protect them? From what, Mrs. Pierce?" Before she could respond, another figure emerged from the darkness. This time, a man cloaked in a dark robe, his face hidden behind a mask. The air seemed to crackle with tension, and I instinctively stepped back, my hand moving to my side, ready for any sudden movement. "Step aside, Watson," Holmes whispered. "This man is no mere servant." The masked figure remained silent, unmoving. It was as though he, too, knew that the housekeeper had been coerced into assisting the conspiracy, unwilling to speak further. And yet there was something sinister in the stillness, as if he was waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, Holmes's sharp voice broke through the standoff. "You think this is over, but it is not. The web you've spun will unravel." The masked figure's hand darted toward his cloak, and before I could react, he threw something to the ground. Smoke erupted into the air, thick and suffocating. When the smoke cleared, the figure was gone, but a blood-red handprint marked the stone floor, accompanied by a chilling message scrawled in chalk. "Justice will rise with the dawn." The words burned in my mind as Holmes and I were left standing in the darkness, the weight of the unspoken threat hanging between us. The masked figure's sudden disappearance left the passage thick with tension, a heavy silence lingering in the wake of his swift retreat. In a blur, the smoke cleared, and all that remained of the intruder was the echo of his movements, now lost in the labyrinth of the estate. Holmes's eyes were fixed on the ground, where a crimson handprint stained the stone floor. It was unmistakable, the mark of a man desperate to leave his trail, even as he fled. "By God," I murmured, my heart racing. "He's gone." Holmes nodded, his expression unyielding. "Indeed, but not without leaving his message." On the wall before us, scrawled hastily in chalk, were the words, "Justice will rise with the dawn." The phrase hung in the air as if the very walls had absorbed its foreboding weight. I could feel the hairs on my neck stand on end as I turned to Holmes. "We must tread carefully, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low, almost to himself. "This man's escape was no accident. He's left us a challenge, a threat that we must unravel before it rises beyond our control." I nodded, uneasy, knowing that with each passing moment the enigma deepened. Holmes knelt before the wall, his fingers brushing over the chalked message as though he could glean more from it by touch alone. This is no mere boast, it is a deliberate taunt. I watched, fascinated and disturbed by his calm demeanor in the face of such danger. Who is he, Holmes? And what does he mean by "justice will rise with the dawn"? Holmes stood abruptly, his sharp eyes never leaving the inscription. The message is a promise, one that speaks of a time and place and of actions yet to come. The phrase suggests a reckoning, but the dawn will not come soon enough for those involved. My thoughts were clouded with apprehension. Is it a warning to us, then, to stay away? "No," Holmes replied, his voice colder than I had ever heard it. "It is a challenge. The masked man seeks to make his mark before the dawn, and he will stop at nothing to see his plans come to fruition. We must beat him to the prize." As I absorbed the weight of his words, I felt a tightening in my chest. The stakes had never been higher, and I feared the answer to this mystery would come at a terrible cost. As we sat in the dimly lit study, Holmes's piercing gaze fixed upon me, his mind turning with unparalleled precision. "Watson, the pieces have finally fallen into place. It is now time to piece together the true nature of these events." He stood abruptly, pacing before me, the air thick with the weight of his thoughts. Mr. Brayton and Mr. Huxley were not mere associates. They were partners in a venture far darker than I initially suspected, one founded on the cruel foundation of greed. I could scarcely believe the words, yet Holmes's confidence left no room for doubt. He continued, his voice unwavering. Huxley sought to manipulate Brayton into signing over his wealth. The forged document, the blackmail, these were but the first steps in a much grander scheme. Brayton's wealth was not the only prize, Watson. The true objective was control. Control? I echoed, my mind struggling to keep pace with his deductions. Precisely, Holmes replied. Brayton's vast estate, his business interests, and his social influence, they were to be used to further Huxley's own ambitions. But something went awry, something Brayton could not foresee. Betrayal. Greed overcame reason, and the situation spiraled into violence. I felt a chill creep through me as the gravity of the situation became clear. Holmes had reconstructed not only a series of actions, but the very essence of their motivations. His voice dropped, almost contemplative. It was not merely a matter of money, Watson. It was the desire to erase a rival, to eliminate the last obstacle in a plan long in the making. Brayton was not killed for the sake of profit alone. He was killed to cover the betrayal that had already begun. I sat back, stunned by the depth of the conspiracy, as Holmes's gaze turned cold, his mind already anticipating the final confrontation. Now, we prepare for the endgame. The pieces are in place, Watson. The truth will soon be laid bare. Holmes's voice grew more measured, his eyes narrowing as he detailed the dark ploy that had begun with a simple, seemingly innocuous plan. The ghostly cries, Watson, were no supernatural phenomenon. They were a calculated maneuver, designed to terrify Mrs. Brayton into abandoning her home. She had become a threat to their designs, an obstacle in the path of the inheritance they so desperately sought. I was taken aback. So, the cries, those dreadful sounds, were meant to force her into a state of fear, to push her into madness, or worse, into exile. Indeed, Holmes confirmed, his expression unwavering. At first, it was only a whisper, a faint sound in the night, easily dismissed as the workings of a mind overwrought with grief. But as the weeks passed, the cries grew more distinct, more insistent. They were crafted to create doubt, to erode Mrs. Brayton's sanity, until she was no longer capable of fighting back. The weight of Holmes's revelation pressed upon me, and I felt a deep sorrow for Mrs. Brayton, whose quiet suffering had been manipulated so cruelly. Who, then, was behind this? I asked, my voice tinged with a mixture of dread and pity. Holmes's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to the shadows of the room. The mastermind was none other than the very person Mrs. Brayton trusted most, the housekeeper. I frowned. The housekeeper? Yes, Holmes affirmed, his tone colder now. She was coerced, Watson, forced to aid the conspirators under duress, her every action watched. She became a pawn in a much larger game, one that she could neither stop nor escape. By Huxley? By those who sought to profit from Brayton's death, Holmes replied. The cries were but the first act in a drama of betrayal and vengeance. The housekeeper, unwitting or not, was a crucial piece of the puzzle. And now, the true extent of her involvement is becoming clear. The realization hit me hard. Mrs. Brayton had not been the sole victim in this tragic affair. The whole household had been swept into a web of deceit, with no escape in sight. Holmes's mind raced, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest as he pieced together the final part of the mystery. It is time, Watson. Time to unmask the final player in this sordid drama. I looked at him, still reeling from the revelations. "You mean the masked figure, the one who has been dogging our every step?" "Exactly," Holmes replied, his voice laced with a quiet certainty. "The man behind the mask is none other than a relative of Mr. Huxley, someone driven not only by the desire for Brayton's wealth but by a deeper, personal grievance. A man who was wronged in ways that could not be undone." "A relative," I echoed, my mind spinning. "But why wear the mask? Why not reveal himself?" Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile, a reflection of the satisfaction that comes from unraveling a knot. "The mask, Watson, is a symbol of vengeance. A shield to protect his identity while he exacts his revenge. He has hidden in the shadows, biding his time until the moment of reckoning arrived." "Revenge for what?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "For a betrayal, Watson. A betrayal that stretches back many years, when Huxley's brother, a man of wealth and ambition, was wronged by Brayton's father. The masked figure is a descendant of that brother, seeking to avenge the wrongs of the past by ensuring that Brayton's legacy falls to ashes." Holmes paused, his eyes flashing with recognition. "The masked figure is no mere avenger of his uncle's name. He seeks to erase the Brayton name entirely, through death, manipulation, and deceit." I could feel the tension in the air, a thick, palpable presence. We were on the precipice of the final confrontation. Holmes's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall put an end to this madness once and for all." The night was thick with an unnatural quiet as Holmes and I made our way to the Brayton family crypt. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faintest trace of decaying stone. Holmes's pace was brisk, his eyes sharp as ever, though his demeanor betrayed none of the tension that tightened my chest. I, however, could scarcely keep the weight of anticipation from settling in my stomach. "There," Holmes muttered, his voice almost a whisper. "The time has come." We had tracked the masked figure here, the crypt's iron gates standing as the final barrier between us and the truth. As we approached, the silhouette of the figure emerged from the shadows, its figure unmistakably rigid and determined. The masked figure, no longer hiding behind illusions, seemed ready for the inevitable confrontation. Holmes stopped abruptly, turning toward me. "Watson, stay back. The moment we move, it will all unravel." I nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. The masked figure stepped forward, as if drawn into the snare Holmes had so carefully laid. Holmes's voice rang out, clear and cold. "You are no longer hidden, are you? The ghostly cries, the tricks, your game ends here." The figure faltered, the mask trembling as though it would collapse under the weight of its own deceit. Holmes moved with swift precision, his words sharp as a dagger. "You've been seeking revenge, haven't you? For the wrongs your family suffered." A pause, then a slow and inevitable lowering of the mask. The man behind it was revealed at last. Edward Huxley's vengeful nephew, a man driven by his need for retribution, his eyes dark with the weight of years of grievance. And then, with a simple step forward, Holmes had him cornered, trapped within the very walls that had long held his ancestors' secrets. "Confess, and I may offer you some mercy," Holmes said, his voice cool but tinged with the finality of justice. The crypt, as if holding its breath, waited for the truth to spill forth. As we left the crypt behind, the weight of the confession still hung heavy in the night air. The masked figure, now revealed to be Huxley's nephew, had crumbled beneath Holmes's unyielding deductions. The path to his confession had been laid so effortlessly by Holmes's calculated moves that I, for one, felt an uncomfortable tremor of awe in the wake of it. We walked in silence, the only sound our footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. I stole a glance at Holmes, whose expression remained as impassive as ever. Yet, beneath the cool exterior, I sensed the satisfaction of a mystery unraveled, of justice served. As we reached our lodgings, I could not suppress the words that sprang to my lips. "Holmes, your brilliance continues to astound me. How you piece together such a convoluted web of deceit and revenge. It is beyond anything I could have imagined." Holmes did not reply immediately. He merely turned his eyes to me, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his lips. "It is only through the understanding of human nature, Watson, that one can ever hope to see the truth." But even as he spoke, I knew that there was more to this case than mere intellect. There was a chilling reminder within it, how easily greed and vengeance could twist a life, and how sometimes the deepest secrets were buried not in places, but in the hearts of men. The morning light crept softly through the curtains of our modest Baker Street apartment. The faint warmth of dawn broke the night's chill, and the silence between Holmes and me seemed to hold a weight, one that even the rising sun could not dispel. I sat at the desk, quill in hand, reflecting on the tumultuous events that had unfolded. Holmes, however, seemed distant, his sharp eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond the window. The case was done. Mr. Brayton's murder had been solved, and justice had found its path, albeit through a labyrinth of greed, revenge, and deceit. The quiet of our surroundings, so stark in contrast to the chaos we had faced, was almost unsettling. Holmes broke the silence with a quiet exhalation, his voice low but deliberate. "It is a strange thing, Watson, the darkness within men's hearts, their desires, their lust for power and wealth, how far they will go to manipulate others, to feed on their fears." I nodded, not trusting my voice to answer. The words, though familiar, held a deeper resonance today. The finality of the case, the closing of a chapter, seemed to only highlight the endless cycle of human folly. I gazed out the window, watching as the city slowly came to life. The fog from the river lingered, curling around the buildings, an ever-present reminder that even in daylight, darkness still holds sway. As Holmes turned his attention to the smoldering remains of his pipe, I couldn't help but return to the thought of Mrs. Brayton. Her life, though no longer in peril, had been irrevocably altered by the events that transpired. Her grief, I knew, would not fade swiftly. The house she once called home, now a mere symbol of betrayal and loss, would forever remind her of the shadows that had darkened her doorstep. "Holmes," I began, my pen scratching across the page, "do you think she will ever find peace, after everything she has endured?" He did not respond immediately, as though the question had no clear answer. The quiet stretched between us, the hum of the city below offering little comfort. "Peace, Watson," he said at last, his tone distant, "is often nothing more than an illusion, a fleeting moment of calm, a brief respite in the storm. What Mrs. Brayton must face now is the price of her survival, the haunting weight of what was done to her, the deception that nearly destroyed her. Can there be peace after such a price?" His words resonated deeply within me, and I put my quill down, reflecting on the truth of them. No amount of time or distance could erase the scars left behind. I wondered then, as I gazed at the empty streets below, whether any of us could ever truly find peace after enduring the harshest trials of life. Holmes's gaze shifted toward the window, and I knew that his mind had wandered far from the present. His thoughts, always so sharp, seemed now to be drifting into a realm beyond mere criminal pursuits. "Human nature," he began, his voice tinged with an unusual gravity, "is a tempestuous thing, Watson. Beneath the veneer of civility lies a multitude of vices, hidden behind walls of decorum and politeness. Greed, for instance. It is a force as primal as any, yet so cleverly disguised within the workings of society. Men like Huxley or his nephew, blinded by their desire for power, are but one example of how this shadow shapes the course of our lives." I leaned back, wondering where this was leading. Holmes rarely ventured into such philosophical reflections. It is not just their greed that drives them, but the lengths they will go to manipulate others, to strike at the fears of those they wish to control. The cries in the night were no mere echo of a haunting Watson. They were a weapon, a tool of psychological terror designed to fracture a woman's very sense of reality. And yet, it was all built upon an illusion, a fragile construct of lies. He took a long draw from his pipe, his eyes narrowing as he exhaled slowly. And yet, despite all this, truth remains. It is the one thing that cannot be twisted, cannot be hidden. The truth, however bitter, always finds its way to the surface. I was silent for a moment, pondering the depth of Holmes's words. It was not often that he reflected on such matters, but when he did, his insight was both sobering and profound. "And what of peace, Holmes?" I asked, returning to the question that lingered in my thoughts. "Is there no peace to be found?" "Peace," he repeated, almost as if to himself, "is a temporary respite. Truth, however, is eternal." With that, he turned his attention back to his pipe, as if dismissing the conversation entirely. I sat in quiet contemplation, the weight of his words settling upon me like a heavy fog, both unsettling and illuminating. The truth was indeed unyielding, and in its pursuit, peace was often but a fleeting moment. As the final embers of the night flickered out, Holmes sat still, his fingers resting lightly on the surface of his desk. The first light of morning crept into our modest sitting room, casting a pale glow over the papers that lay scattered about, each one containing the remnants of a mystery now solved. Watson, his quill poised in midair, seemed lost in his thoughts, the weight of the recent events lingering heavily between us. It was in the quiet aftermath of our reflections that the doorbell rang, its shrill sound breaking the calm that had settled over Baker Street. Holmes did not flinch at the interruption. His eyes, however, gleamed with the familiar fire of a curiosity. "That will be our new client, Watson," he remarked, his voice soft but assured. "The game is afoot once again." I set my pen down, watching as Holmes stood from his chair and crossed the room to answer the door. Within moments, a distinguished gentleman, clad in a dark overcoat and a bowler hat, entered. His presence was imposing, yet there was a palpable air of anxiety surrounding him. He was older than most of the clients who sought Holmes's services, his face weathered, and his eyes troubled. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" The man's voice was tremulous, though his posture betrayed a man accustomed to authority. "I've heard of your remarkable talents, and I require your assistance in a matter of the gravest importance." Holmes studied the man carefully for a moment, his gaze sharp and perceptive. "Please, take a seat," he said, gesturing toward the armchair opposite his desk. "I have no doubt that the mystery you bring will prove most interesting." The man hesitated before lowering himself into the chair with a sigh of relief. He placed a leather-bound folder on the table and pushed it forward. "I find myself caught in a web, Mr. Holmes. A series of inexplicable events have been happening within my family, and I fear they may lead to something far darker than I can comprehend." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in that familiar, calculating manner. "Tell me everything, Mr. Carrington," he said. "Leave no detail unspoken. A new enigma awaits us, and I shall not rest until it is unraveled." I glanced at Holmes as he began to listen intently, his mind already whirring with possibilities. Even as we settled into the beginning of this new case, I couldn't shake the feeling that, once again, we were stepping into the unknown, where danger and intrigue awaited us at every turn. The fog outside thickened, and I knew that another tale of mystery was about to unfold, one that would challenge us in ways we had yet to foresee. The door of Baker Street closed softly behind Mr. Carrington as he began recounting his troubling story, and as I listened, I could already sense that the next chapter in our adventures was about to begin. Holmes, ever the enigmatic figure, already seemed to have glimpsed the threads of the puzzle, though he said nothing for now. The silence that fell between us was filled only with the sound of the crackling fire and the faint thrum of the city beyond. The game, as always, was afoot.